the boys' locker room at a high school, a chubby guy is dancing in the shower while his giggling classmates watch. Meanwhile, in the school gym, the Student of the Year award ceremony is underway. Calvin Joyner, nicknamed the Golden Jet, is about to receive the award. As Calvin starts his motivational speech, the moment is interrupted when the naked guy from the locker room is kicked out into the gym, causing everyone to laugh. Calvin, feeling sorry for him, gives the poor guy his varsity jacket to cover up. Fast forward to the present, Calvin's life isn't as glamorous. He works a mundane office job, watching his colleagues get promoted, while dealing with annoying jokes from a coworker. Though he's married to his high school sweetheart, Maggie, Calvin feels unfulfilled. Over dinner, Maggie is excited about their upcoming college reunion, but Calvin reveals he doesn't want to go. He admits that he feels insecure about his job, as everyone had such high expectations for him, and now he's just an accountant instead of the governor or big shot they anticipated. The next day, Calvin is scrolling through his social media feed when he notices a friend request from someone named Bob Stone. He doesn't recognize the name but decides to accept the request. Soon after, Bob invites him out for a beer. Curious, Calvin asks how they know each other, and to his surprise, he realizes that Bob Stone is actually Robbie, the awkward outcast from high school who had been humiliated in front of everyone. Shocked at the transformation, Calvin can't believe this confident, muscular man is the same Robbie from years ago. They sit down to have a beer, chatting and catching up. Calvin starts to relax and have fun until a random guy tries to take Bob's seat while he's at the bar grabbing more drinks. Calvin tries to explain that the chair is taken, but the stranger escalates things. When Bob returns, he handles the situation effortlessly, leaving Calvin stunned by how easily he defused the tension. Afterward, Bob suggests they go for a bike ride, and the two head to their old high school, reminiscing about the past. While Calvin is reliving pleasant memories of high school, Bob seems more somber. He opens up to Calvin, confessing that ever since the humiliating incident in high school, he's never undressed in front of anyone again. As they wander through the school, they come across a showcase dedicated to the class of '96, featuring a display full of Calvin's achievements, trophies, photos, and certificates. Despite the recognition, Calvin isn't happy about it, muttering that his younger self would probably think he's a failure. Frustrated, Calvin says goodbye to Bob and heads home, though Bob isn't quite ready to part ways. Bob explains that he's been having some issues with his payroll and asks for Calvin's professional help as an accountant. He follows Calvin home, where they attempt to sort out Bob's finances, but things go awry when Bob accidentally spills beer on Calvin's laptop. With nowhere else to go, Bob asks to stay the night, crashing on Calvin's couch. The next morning, Calvin wakes up to a knock at the door. A woman introduces herself as a CIA agent and asks if Calvin has had any contact with Bob Stone. Shocked and scared, Calvin immediately gives Bob away, but when he turns around, Bob has already vanished. Officer Harris informs Calvin that Bob is wanted for murder and treason, leaving Calvin in shock as he realizes how dangerous things have become. Calvin tries to distance himself from Bob, but Harris reveals that Bob listed Calvin as his emergency contact, meaning he'll have to help catch him. Reluctantly, Calvin is now part of a plan to act as bait for the CIA. At Calvin's office, the phone rings. It's Bob. He urgently asks Calvin to meet him on the stairs. The CIA rushes to intercept Bob, but he manages to outsmart them once again. Frustrated, Calvin demands answers, but Bob refuses to explain. Instead, he hands Calvin a gun, ignites a fire alarm, and chaos ensues. Calvin runs out of the office, panicking as an intense shootout unfolds between Bob and the CIA agents. Bob skillfully incapacitates most of his pursuers, and the two nearly escape. However, they are stopped by another CIA team at the elevators. Bob tries to buy them some time with polite conversation, keeping the agents at bay for a few crucial moments. As the office descends into chaos, Bob seizes the moment to escape. He shoots through a panoramic window and jumps down with Calvin, landing on an inflatable gorilla below. Once safely in the car, Bob finally explains everything to Calvin. He reveals that 3 weeks ago, a dangerous criminal known as the Black Badger stole keys to American spyware and plans to sell them at an auction to the highest bidder. Bob is determined to stop him, but Calvin, overwhelmed by the situation, wants out. He insists that Bob is a criminal and that he wants nothing to do with the mission. Bob, sensing Calvin's hesitation, tells him the truth about what happened. He recounts how he and his partner, Phil, were close to capturing the Black Badger. However, when they neared their goal, Phil got trapped in an elevator rigged with a bomb and tragically died. Bob failed to catch the criminal, and Phil's death was pinned on him, turning him into a fugitive. Calvin, moved by Bob's story, feels a twinge of sympathy, but still pleads to go home and escape the mess. Bob breaks it down to Calvin. Officer Harris and the CIA likely have Calvin's house under constant surveillance now, making him a part of this mission whether he likes it or not. Their intense conversation is suddenly interrupted by an unexpected visitor. While Bob is dealing with an intruder, Calvin seizes the chance to steal Bob's bike and quickly calls his wife, Maggie, asking her not to go home but to meet him at their new marriage counselor's office. On his way, Officer Harris intercepts Calvin, convincing him that Bob is not only mentally unstable but also the real Black Badger. Swayed by her claims, Calvin accepts a tracking device, which he's instructed to activate when he meets Bob again. Calvin arrives late to the marriage counseling session, trying not to put Maggie at risk. He pretends not to know Bob, and they engage in harmless games and role-playing exercises. However, Calvin can't hold back his frustration, losing his temper and upsetting Maggie, who leaves in anger. Just as he's about to activate the alert device given by Harris, Bob reassures him and explains that he needs Calvin's help to locate the codes. Oddly enough, Calvin believes Bob and takes him to his friend Trevor, who specializes in international transactions. Trevor, who embarrassed Bob back in high school, initially appears polite and apologetic for his past behavior. However, it quickly becomes apparent that Trevor hasn't changed at all. As Calvin follows Bob out of the office, he gets a call from Officer Harris, who demands that he keep Bob there until her team arrives. Outside, Bob confides in Calvin, telling him that Calvin was the only one in high school who didn't bully him, which is why he's the only person Bob can trust. Feeling guilty, Calvin admits that he turned Bob into the CIA. Later, Harris interrogates Bob, but he refuses to talk. Frustrated, she orders her team to bring in torture instruments. Meanwhile, Calvin hatches a plan to distract the guards. He manages to get the keys and enters the interrogation room where Bob is held. The two friends chain the chairs to the table and make a daring escape. Bob then asks Calvin if he still has the transaction numbers from Trevor. Calvin reveals that the numbers are actually coordinates of where the deal is about to happen. Using a burner phone, they trace the location to Boston. The duo heads to a private airfield and searches for an aircraft. While Calvin distracts the local security guard, Bob prepares the plane for takeoff. In the parking lot, Bob observes a group of men led by a client, while Calvin spots Officer Harris at the entrance. Convinced she must be the Black Badger, he tries to call Bob for backup, but Bob doesn't answer. Fearing for his friend's safety, Calvin rushes into the parking lot to warn him. Just then, chaos erupts. Bob shoots his partner, Phil, and retrieves a flash drive from his pocket. To Calvin's shock, Phil emerges from behind a pillar, revealing he's alive and claiming to be the Black Badger. He possesses the codes, and the impatient client demands both flash drives. Phil tosses the drives on the ground just as a CIA team storms the parking lot, leading to an intense firefight. In the midst of the chaos, Calvin manages to recover one of the flash drives and makes a run for it. The client in a car nearly catches up to him, but Bob intervenes just in time, saving Calvin. However, instead of feeling grateful, Calvin is overwhelmed and takes off towards a nearby bridge. Before long, he finds himself trapped, with Bob on one side and Phil on the other. Both men desperately plead for Calvin to believe them. Tensions rise as Bob and Phil start shooting at each other. In the confusion, Phil loses his weapon, and Calvin picks it up. Acting out of either negligence or resentment, he unexpectedly fires at Bob, hitting him. Phil then demands that Calvin hand over the codes. His gun clicks empty, leaving him vulnerable. Phil revels in his taunts, asserting that Bob could never be the Black Badger because he's just a sentimental weakling, unlike Phil, who claims to be the clever one. He reveals his grand scheme of faking his death to manipulate everyone around him. In a moment of desperation, Calvin decides to use his signature move, a distraction that gives Bob the opening he needs. Bob seizes the opportunity and kicks Phil off the building. With the danger averted, they hand over the codes to Officer Harris and prepare to head to the reunion party. Arriving at the party in a helicopter, Calvin introduces Maggie to Bob, expressing regret for not appreciating the simple happiness that comes from being with loved ones. The three enter the gym just in time for the announcement of the prom king and queen. As Bob feels a surge of anxiety and nearly bolts, Calvin reassures him, revealing that he hacked the voting system to secure Bob's victory. The crowd erupts in applause as Bob steps forward to claim his moment. He locks eyes with Trevor, who begins his usual ridicule, but this time, Bob stands tall and fearless. He knocks Trevor out with a single punch, shocking everyone. Taking the stage, Bob delivers a heartfelt speech about how 20 years ago he stood there helpless and mocked, but now he has a best friend who taught him to embrace who he is. In a surprising turn, Bob rips off his clothes and stands proudly naked before the audience, symbolizing his newfound confidence. Several months later, Bob waits outside for Calvin, who is saying goodbye to his pregnant wife. Bob presents Calvin with a memento from their past, a gesture of support as Calvin embarks on his first day at the CIA.